I used to think ghosts belonged to other people's towns and other people's stories, the kind you hear at a diner after midnight when the coffee is burnt and the pie tastes like winter. I did not think they belonged to a normal kid from a normal street with a mailbox that stuck in the snow every January. But then the fall of 2006 rolled through like a slow-moving bus, and I moved into a drafty off-campus house near the older end of town, and now I am that person who talks too long when someone asks if I have ever seen anything I cannot explain. Back then, my life was simple in that messy college way. I worked mornings in the library shelving returns and trying not to drop my student ID in the elevator crack. I went to classes with the same beat-up backpack I had since senior year of high school. I studied in the basement computer lab because the machines down there ran cool and the printer never jammed. On Saturdays, I watched football with my roommates and pretended I understood statistics. I was a normal person with normal worries, like whether the bus would be on time or whether my shoes squeaked too loudly in the hallway. I did not keep crystals or burn sage or read tarot. I did not go looking for anything strange. Our house was on a shaded street that curved like a river. It had peeling paint, the color of old oatmeal, and a porch that leaned toward the sidewalk as if eavesdropping on neighbors. Inside, the floors were original hardwood that complained at every footstep. My room was at the back, small and square, with one window that looked at the narrow side yard where the grass never decided if it wanted to live. The rent was cheap because the landlord said the house was historic. He said that like it was a feature, not a note of apology. The first week felt like any first week. I arranged my books by size because alphabetical order made the shelf look like it had teeth. I taped a map over a crack in the plaster. I wrote my name on a box of cereal and put it on the kitchen counter as if labels could stop a roommate with the late-night munchies. I slept like a rock, not because I was peaceful, but because the days were long. If anything pressed a finger to my dreams, I did not notice. Then came a Thursday in late September, the air cool enough that I could see my breath in the early morning if I stepped onto the porch. I had a late class and planned to sleep in. Around dawn, before the city buses started their groaning routes, I woke to a soft tapping. It was not a window rattle or a dry leaf doing a slow dance against the glass. It was close. 3 taps, a small pause, then 2 more, friendly and patient, like someone who knows you are home. My first thought was that a branch had learned manners. My second thought was that I did not own anything that could make that sound from inside the room. I told myself not to be dramatic. I rolled over. The taps came again, 3 and 2, right near the back of my head. I turned and stared at the wall. My posters lay still. The crack in the plaster did not widen. The map did not lift its corner. I raised my hand and knocked back without planning to, 3 and 2, like a joke. Nothing happened. I felt foolish, in the way you feel foolish when you wave at a person who turns out to be waving at someone behind you. By late morning, the tapping had become a story I did not plan to tell. That afternoon, I went to campus, did my shift at the library, and listened to a professor explain the difference between knowing and believing in a way that made me think he had never lost his keys. The sun folded itself down in orange layers while I walked home. The house looked ordinary. The porch steps the same tilting grin, the kitchen light left on by someone who never learned to turn things off. I ate leftover pizza that tasted like cardboard and pepperoni and sat on the floor with my back against my bed, reading. Around midnight, just as my eyes began to sting, the taps returned, close to my ear, delicate and sure. I told the room out loud that this was very funny. I told the room I had an early morning. I told the room I was not scared. The truth was, I felt like someone had leaned over my shoulder to see the page. People think fear is a loud thing. For me, it began as a thin thread in the chest. I tugged at it without meaning to, and it tightened. I tried to measure the sound. It was not in the wall. It was not the window. It was not the headboard. I slid my mattress 3 inches to the left and waited. The taps followed, polite, patient, 3 and 2. I slept with the light on like a child too honest to pretend otherwise. Friday, I told my roommate Jules. Jules was the kind of person who hung plants from curtain rods and remembered everyone's birthday. She had a calm face that made you want to confess small sins, like taking the last clean spoon and putting it back dirty. She listened with the kind of attention that feels expensive, Then she said the house was old and old houses make noises. She suggested a pipe. She suggested a mouse, which made me flinch. She suggested I was tired, which I was. She offered me earplugs. I let her words stack inside me like folded towels, warm and reasonable. That night, the taps did not come. I fell asleep fast and woke around 3 in the morning to something else. It was a smell, faint and metallic, like pennies and rain. My eyes were open before I knew they were open. The room was quiet in that thick way that makes quiet feel like a presence. I sat up and listened, even though there was nothing to hear. When the taps finally returned around 7, they sounded like they had been standing there all night, waiting for me to notice. In October, after midterms, small things began to slip out of place. A pen I kept on the desk appeared on the windowsill. A book I had been reading lay open to a page I did not remember reaching. My mug, which I always left on the left side of the sink, stood alone on the right. I blamed my own absent mind. I blamed roommates. I blamed the way moving into a new place makes your habits sloppy. On a Saturday morning, I woke to my shoes lined up neatly by the door, laces tucked inside like someone had been taught to make a tidy scene. I do not line up shoes. I kick them off in a small storm. I stared at them until the sun rounded the edge of the curtain and made shapes on the floor that looked like a map I could not read. Around then, I started keeping a journal, not because I believed, but because I needed a record that did not bend to my mood. I wrote in it in the voice I am using now, simple and plain, like how you explain a route to a stranger. October 12th, mug moved, faint smell of pennies, tapping at dawn. October 16th, woke up with words in my head that were not mine, something about a door that does not lock from the inside. October 21st, wind strong, leaves slapping the siding, tapping consistent, 3 and 2, polite. My parents called and asked if I was eating enough. I said yes. They asked if my classes were interesting. I said sometimes. They asked if I was getting enough sleep. I said of course. I did not tell them that I had begun to set 2 alarms, because sometimes the first one did not wake me, not because I did not hear it, but because I woke to find it disabled. The little toggle switched with a care I do not use at 4 in the morning. I did not tell them that on a Tuesday I woke to my desk chair, turned to face the door as if it had been expecting company. I tried small experiments because small experiments felt like something a sensible person might do. I put a quarter on the windowsill and traced around it in pencil. In the morning, the quarter sat in the same circle but turned so the head faced away. I placed a paperback on the nightstand with a bookmark standing like a flag. The next day the bookmark had been laid flat, its tail tucked into the page as if someone had decided the flag was too dramatic. I set my alarm, then taped a strip of paper over the switch so that if it moved, the tape would tear. At dawn, the alarm did not go off. The tape was unbroken. When I peeled it back, the switch sat in the off position. I told myself I must have misremembered. I told myself there was a draft. I told myself that telling myself was working. On Halloween, the house held a party, because that is what you do in a student neighborhood when the leaves are loud and you want to feel like you belong to the street. People came dressed as ideas. Someone was a traffic cone. Someone else was a celebrity I did not recognize. I tried to enjoy it. I smiled at the right places. I poured cheap cider into paper cups. The music made my walls breathe. At some point I slipped to my room to drop off my jacket. The light was already on. I did not remember leaving it on. The small journal lay open on my desk. There were words on a page that I did not write, not a paragraph. A sentence, written in the careful print of someone taught to write when pens made smudges. It said, "This is not yours." My first thought was that a friend with a strange sense of humor had wandered where they should not. My second thought was that the handwriting had a patient shape I recognized from nowhere. I picked up the journal as if it might bite and carried it to the kitchen. I told Jules. She went pale, then tried to make her face gentle. She said people do things at parties. I said, I know. We checked the doors. The front was locked. The back stuck the way it always stuck, with a stubborn mouth that needed a shoulder to persuade it. We walked the rooms. We saw nothing except a plastic spider in the bathroom sink. In the days after, I kept the journal hidden under my mattress, a habit that felt childish in a way that helped me breathe. More sentences appeared, not every night, not even most nights, but often enough that I could not pretend it was a prank that required someone with a key and endless patience. Sometimes the sentence felt like a warning. Sometimes it felt like a complaint. Sometimes it did not feel like any kind of message at all, just a strand of a thought that had fallen loose and landed on my page. The one that stayed with me said, "It keeps raining, even when the sun is out." I walked around for 2 days after that, staring at puddles as if they could explain themselves. By November, I knew the rhythm of the tapping, the way you know the schedule of a train that passes when you are trying to nap. 3 and 2, polite as a knock from a neighbor asking if you could keep it down. I had stopped knocking back. It felt like feeding a stray animal that might not stay astray. Instead, I started speaking aloud. I said, "I live here too." I said, "Please stop moving my things." I said, "I am sorry if I am in your way." I said these things in the morning when the light made the room feel like it belonged to the living, and also at night when the room held its breath. I did not expect answers, and I did not get any as far as sound goes. But small changes followed. The mug stayed where I left it more often than not. The chair faced the desk. The journal pages remained blank for almost a week. Then, the week before Thanksgiving, a memory came to me that did not feel like mine. I was walking across the quad in a coat that was not my coat, the sleeves too short, the lining a little scratchy, and I could not find the library, though I had walked this campus in all 4 seasons. I could smell iron and wet leaves. I could hear a bus I could not see. The feeling passed when I reached the student union doors. Like when you step from a shadow into a sudden square of Sunday, I stood still until the automatic doors gave up and closed on my shoulder. That night, the sentence in the journal returned after its small vacation. It said, "The door does not lock from the inside." I pressed my palm to the page as if I could smooth the words back into blankness. I was tired in the way that stains everything. I brushed my teeth at the kitchen sink because our bathroom faucet decided to cough brown water for a week. I set my alarm and stuck a second strip of tape over it, even though I knew that trick did not matter. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the house click and settle. I almost drifted when the tapping began again, patient, 3 and 2, from the empty corner near the dresser. I said, "I hear you." I said, "Please give me sleep." The room did not answer. The taps kept their small beat. After a while, I fell into a thin sleep anyway. My dream was a narrow hallway with yellow walls and a row of closed doors. I had the feeling that something important waited behind each door and that my hands were clean in a way that made opening anything feel like a risk. I woke to daylight and silence. My alarm had not gone off. Both strips of tape were unbroken. The switch sat off, the tiny gray line like a closed eyelid. I did not cry, not then. I laughed once, a small sound that made my own throat feel like a stranger's. I wrote in the journal with a steady hand. I wrote, "I am listening." I wrote, "I do not know what you want." I wrote, "Please be gentle." I left for class with my backpack heavier than it had any right to be, as if paper could pretend to be lead. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, the first snow fell, wet and childish, and the town smelled like new pennies again. I walked home slowly to watch the flakes melt on the backs of my hands. My house looked tired and kind, the way people look after a party has ended and they finally get to sit down. Inside, the air had a quiet that was not empty. In my room, the journal lay closed. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited, though, for what I could not have said, I did not have to wait long. The taps began, 3 and 2. I looked toward the corner. I said, "All right." I said, "I am here." And then something happened that made me set down the pen I am using now and close my eyes even as I tell you. The tapping changed, not the rhythm, the source. It came from the old closet door with the little brass knob, the door that never quite latched unless you lifted it and asked nicely. 3 and 2, patient. I stood. I walked across the wooden floor and felt each board remember every foot that had crossed it. I put my hand on the knob and waited for courage to arrive, like a bus that keeps its schedule even in the snow. I turned the knob. The door came open a few inches and stopped against the weight of something soft. The smell of iron and damp cloth came out like a breath that had been held too long. I reached in and felt wool, a coat maybe, and behind it the smooth skin of wood. There was no person in there. There was no trick. My hand brushed against a nail head that caught my sleeve. I pulled free, and the tapping stopped as cleanly as a song cut short. Nothing moved. The house settled with a long sigh. Somewhere far away, a siren wound itself up and down like a child on a hill. I closed the closet carefully. I said thank you without thinking about to whom. Then I sat back down on the bed and put my palms on my knees like someone trying to anchor their body to the chair during turbulence. I felt calm and not calm at the same time, the way a quiet lake can still hide a deep cold underneath. I did not tell anyone that night. I did not write in the journal. I lay on my back and watched the ceiling shift with streetlight and snow and told myself that whatever this was, it had a shape. Shapes, even strange ones, can be learned. I woke the next morning with that steady winter light that makes the walls look farther away. My phone lay face down on the floor as if it had decided to sleep somewhere else. I held it and waited for the dread to arrive, but nothing sharp came. Only that odd calm you get after you finally admit you heard what you heard. The closet door sat closed, humble as always. I brushed my teeth and went about the day as if I had not stood there the night before with my hand on the old brass knob, as if I had not smelled wet wool and iron, as if the tapping had not stopped the moment I made space for it. It felt like making a bed around a secret. Campus after Thanksgiving always had a half-empty feeling, like a theater after intermission when some people do not come back. I walked past piles of snow that looked like they were trying to become something else. My friend Ben waved at me from the bookstore steps and called out that the campus coffee cart was finally serving peppermint hot chocolate, which sounded like a dare. I told him I would meet him after my shift. He nodded and did that thing where he jogs backward while talking, which always made me anxious for his ankles. I liked these easy moments. They made the strange thing at home feel like a room I could close the door on. In the library, I shelved returns and hummed a tune I did not know. It took a full minute of humming before I realized I was repeating the rhythm of the knocks in a melody that did not exist until I made it. 3 small notes, a pause, then 2, like a child's song for remembering a rule. I stopped humming. I stood there in the narrow aisle and felt the old building breathe, the way big buildings do. A slow draft through a door on the other side of the floor, a heater waking, the little tremble of a window that does not quite love its frame. I told myself I was fine. When a patron asked me where to find a biography of a president from long ago, I answered as if nothing in my world tugged at its edges. That night I went home to a kitchen that smelled like onions and dish soap. Jules had left a note in friendly loops saying she made a big pot of soup and to help myself if I was not too proud to accept kindness. I ate 2 bowls and washed the dishes like a person who had never been tempted to leave a spoon to soak forever. When I stood in the doorway of my room, I felt that subtle pressure on the air, like a room after 2 people have been arguing and the words have finished but the heat remains. My journal lay on the desk. I opened it with my stomach, doing a small, slow roll. The page was blank. My breath came out in one long thread. I slept that night with my ear turned toward the closet like a person waiting for the first train after a storm. The tapping came near dawn, not eager but not shy. 3 and 2, I said out loud that I was not a threat. I said out loud that I did not know what to do. The knocks stopped, and in the silence I felt something like attention. Not kindness exactly. More like when a teacher looks at you and waits to see if you have learned how to find the answer yourself. Over the next week, tiny agreements developed. I began to leave a space in front of the closet, pushing my laundry basket to the foot of the bed. The tapping did not come on nights. I fell asleep hard from work and class and walking through slush. It did come on nights I was restless and too full of buzzing thoughts. When it came, I would breathe slower and say a simple good evening, and if I had the journal open, sometimes a sentence would arrive, patient and plain. You would think a message from wherever would be dramatic, but it was never dramatic. It was always domestic, in the way a whisper in a house is domestic. Once it said, "Do not forget the window latch when the wind rises." Once it said, "The back steps ice before the front." Once it said, "The key is under the 3rd board on the porch, except not anymore." I copied the sentences on sticky notes and pretended they were study aids for a class no one else took. There was one sentence that did not fit the pattern. It came on a Wednesday, a weak light day with sleet that made sharp sounds on the porch roof. I sat at the desk with my laptop open and an essay going nowhere. The page in the journal had a faint smudge like a fingertip had rested there too long. Then the words took shape, more pressed in than written, as if the pencil were a weight. It said, "I did not mean to." I stared at it long enough for the sleet to change to rain. I said into the room that I believed them, though I did not know what I was forgiving. I told no one. Not because I liked keeping it, but because I did not know how to give it to someone else. People want stories with beams and creaks and cold spots that smell like roses. I had taps and sentences about latches and a feeling that I was in a conversation with a person who had lost their voice. Still, I changed small habits because small habits are what we have. I started locking the kitchen window every night because of that line about the latch. I started sprinkling salt on the back steps because of that line about ice. I started touching the closet door each morning with my knuckles like a greeting, a small, solid knock that said, "I see you." The next time something truly new happened, it was not at home. It was in the basement computer lab on a Sunday night, the kind of Sunday that tastes like old coffee, even if you have not had any. I sat in a row of humming machines, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a jar of insects. On the monitor, I scrolled through a photo archive for a class project, black and white images of town history, people in stiff clothes, streets without trees, a photo of a parade with faces that looked too serious for a parade. I clicked the next thumbnail without care and then stopped. The picture showed a small house with a leaning porch, paint flaking like old snow, a side yard where grass could not commit. My house, or its twin in an earlier decade. The caption said, "Boarded residence on Maple and 5th, 1968. A second line, handwritten in the scanned margin, said, "One fatality winter, 1967. I put my fingers on the desk and held them still, because that felt like the anchor available. I read the words again, then again after that. One fatality. Winter of 1967. My brain did all the math it could do while the lights hummed and the printer beside me started up for someone else. I told myself this did not mean the person knocking at my closet had come from that winter. I told myself a lot of houses are boarded and a lot of houses hold sadness the way they hold heat. I wrote the caption down in my notebook and underlined the street names 3 times, as if underlining could make the years more obedient. The next day, I skipped my usual faculty office hours and walked to the town records room, a quiet space off the main library that always smelled like paper and the color brown. The clerk was a soft-spoken man with a sweater that had seen better cold. He asked what I was looking for, and I said I was doing a class thing on the neighborhood at Maple and 5th. He nodded like this was the most normal interest anyone had expressed all day. He brought me a bound stack of city directories and a metal drawer of cards with tight typewritten lines. I read for an hour and felt my eyes ache, the way muscles ache after you do a job you have not done in a while. I found our exact address in a list from the 1960s. The tenant listed as a woman with a first name you only hear in stories now. Under her name was a second line, relation unknown, a shorthand the clerks used when they did not know if someone was a cousin or a boarder or a person staying for reasons scribbled in the margins of life. A newspaper clipping in the card file mentioned a winter accident on Maple near 5th, no details, a colder month, a loss. I felt the room grow taller around me. The clerk asked if I needed copies. I smiled in a way that felt like a bad fit and said I was just curious. That evening, I told the room what I had found, gentle and broad, nothing specific. I did not say the word fatality because it felt like inviting a word to sit at your table and never leave. I said I had been thinking about the winter of 1967. The tapping came the way it always came, 3 and 2, patient and close. My hands felt warm and my shoulders felt heavy, a strange mix, like carrying a sleeping child back from a car. I asked a question you are not supposed to ask empty rooms because the answers are not guaranteed and the silence can be louder than any reply. I asked if they had a name. The journal stayed blank for a full minute. Then a single word formed. It was a first name with a round sound, old-fashioned but still found at kitchen tables. I said it out loud, and it felt like a recipe I had almost learned once and then forgotten. I repeated it, and the closet door made the smallest sound as if something like relief had leaned there for a second. I said thank you to the room. I said I was sorry for their winter. I said I would try to keep the air steady. It is a strange thing to carry a name for someone who does not meet you in the usual ways. I found myself using it in my head when I noticed the small movements. When the mug stayed put, I would think, "Thank you," and I would think the name. When the window latch held through a heavy gust, I would think, "Good call," and I would think the name. When the tapping came, I would say, "Good evening," and I would say the name the way you say a friend's name when they come to your door holding a pie, and you do not know if it is for you. Finals came in a blur, that mix of caffeine and cold, and long paragraphs that promise clarity if you read them one more time. Jules and I traded the good seat at the kitchen table and bought cheap candles that made the place smell like vanilla and something pretending to be pine. On a late-night walk back from the lab, I cut through the block behind ours and past the old brick building that used to be the post office. A woman about my age hurried by, scarf up to her nose, and glanced over my shoulder the way you do when a second person seems to be with someone. Her eyes flicked to the space near my left side, then to my face, then away. She said sorry without a reason and kept moving. I stood there, with my breath turning to fog, and had the uneasy thought that I was not alone in the way none of us are, and that now and then it leaks through for other people too. On the last day before break, I packed a small suitcase to go home for a week. I felt guilty about leaving, which is ridiculous if you think about it plainly. I left the journal on the desk, open to a clean page. I wrote that I would be back after a handful of days. I wrote that Jules would be around a lot. I wrote that the thermostat makes a terrible click before the heat comes on and that this does not mean a fire. I wrote thank you for the warnings. I wrote the name. The tapping came right away, 3 and 2, like a signature. I put my hand on the closet door and said goodbye the way you do when you are not sure if goodbye is the right word. I slept easily that night, and that felt like a gift. Home was what home always is, too many cookies and questions about grades, and a mother who sends you back with a scarf you do not need because she cannot send the feeling of warmth any other way. When I told my parents a vague version of the house being strange, I kept the words small and practical. Old pipes, drafts, the usual. My father nodded and said old wood talks when it is cold. My mother said to keep a glass of water on the nightstand for the heat. They did not say move. I did not say anything about names. I returned to the house a few days before New Year's Eve. The sky, a bright pale like the inside of a seashell. The street held that winter quiet that lets you hear the exact squeak of your own boots. Inside, the air smelled closed, a little stale. My room looked undisturbed except for the journal, which had new writing on the page I had left open. It said, "Thank you for the scarf." I touched my neck, confused, then remembered that I had draped my new scarf on the closet knob before I left, half as a joke and half as a way of leaving something warm in a cold house. I smiled in a way I had not smiled at a piece of paper before. I wrote, "You are welcome." The tapping answered, 3 and 2. Peaceful, almost companionable. That night I dreamed of a winter long before mine, a bus stop at the corner, and a person in a too-thin coat standing there with a book under their arm. The snow had that blue evening color that makes all edges soft. The bus did not come for a long time. In the dream I walked up and stood next to them without speaking, like how strangers sometimes form a small team when the weather is bad. When I woke up, my room felt settled in a way that had nothing to do with dust or heat. I thought of the line from the journal that said I did not mean to, and I believed it with a calmness that surprised me. There were still odd hours. One night, in early January, I woke to the sound of the back door, trying its old stuck trick even though the lock was strong. Another night, I woke sure that the bed had been moved a couple inches, and then found the felt pads under the legs, scuffed in a new direction. The taps sometimes came right when I fell asleep, as if to remind me that someone shared the rhythm of the day. But the fear that had sat in my chest like a fist had uncurled to something else. Not acceptance exactly, more an agreement that we were neighbors in the same small room of time, and that the room had windows both of us needed. I kept going to class. I kept shelving books. I learned how to make a pot of soup that did not taste like regret. Sometimes when I left the house, I would say I am going to the library and be home before dark and say the name out loud. Sometimes when I returned to the house, I would say I am back in case anything was listening that needed that kind of anchoring. Once, on a windy afternoon in early February, the journal carried only 2 words, simple and steady. Be careful. I stayed off the back steps that day, and when I went out the front, I saw a plate of ice on the last step that would have spun me down in a graceless tumble if I had tried it. I stood there and felt grateful to a person who had once also walked those steps and learned something the hard way. Years later, when people ask why I did not run, I tell them there was nothing to run from that would not follow me in the shape of not knowing. I tell them it was not like the movies with slammed shut doors and thrown furniture. It was not performance. It was repetition, care, patience. Small warnings from someone whose winter happened long before mine. Back then, I would not have said it so cleanly. Back then, I just tried to sleep enough and to say thank you when I remembered. What matters for this night, in that year, is that the closet, with its old brass knob, felt less like a threat and more like a chapel, a thin place in the house where 2 times touched. The tapping was not a demand so much as a polite habit, and the sentences in the journal were the daily notes left on a fridge by people who share a kitchen and a schedule but not always the same hours. We were practicing how to live together across a line no one explained. I am telling this now with all the air that time puts between a person and the version of them who did the living. Back then I was close to it and muddled and trying to follow the rules of being a decent roommate to the unseen. Now it feels like a season I walked through and survived, and some days I miss the careful kindness of those notes about latches and ice. It is behind me in the way a long winter stands behind a person who made it to spring. Winter of 2007 carried on like it had forgotten how to stop. Snow turned to slush, then froze again, and our little street wore a crust of gray ice that groaned under tires and boots. By then, the tapping had become less like a haunting and more like an odd companion. A sound I could half expect while brushing my teeth or setting my alarm. I would still look toward the closet, still feel that pause in my chest, but it no longer sent the cold straight into my bones. One Sunday night in early February, I came home late from the library. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator doing its slow mechanical breathing. Jules had gone to visit her girlfriend, leaving a note that said, "Please don't die of boredom." I laughed at that, left my boots by the door, and carried my bag upstairs. The air in my room had that closed-up smell again, a mix of dust and something faintly metallic. I turned on the lamp. The journal sat open on the desk, even though I was sure I'd left it closed. The words written there made my throat tighten. It said, "Asterisk, asterisk, you should not have opened the door. Asterisk, asterisk." I stood there a long time, just looking. My fingers twitched toward the page, but I didn't touch it. The closet door stood closed, like always, quiet, harmless. My pulse thudded in my ears. I whispered, "I didn't mean anything bad." My voice cracked on the last word. The light flickered once, sharp and bright, and then steadied. That night, I dreamed of snow falling inside the house. It gathered on the floorboards, on the edges of my desk, on my pillow. I tried to brush it away, but it melted into cold water that ran between the boards. From somewhere under the floor, a soft tapping rose up, muffled but steady 3 and 2, patient, unhurried. I woke gasping, hand on my chest, and realized the sound hadn't come from the dream. It was happening, real and near. The tapping came not from the closet this time, but from the wall near my bed. I sat up, whispering the name I'd learned, almost like a prayer. The sound stopped mid-pattern. The silence that followed was deeper than I'd ever heard. I waited. Then, faintly, from the desk, a creak, and the journal closed itself with a small, tired sound. The next day, I couldn't concentrate. Every sound on campus, every dropped pen, every chair leg sliding made me jump. I tried to talk to Ben about it over lunch, but how do you tell someone that your notebook is writing to you and sometimes tucks itself in at night? I ended up saying I wasn't sleeping much. He told me to try melatonin and less caffeine. It was kind of him, but useless. When I came home that evening, the scarf I'd left on the closet knob was gone. I found it folded neatly on my pillow. On top of it was a single button, brown, cracked down the middle like it had seen many winters. I picked it up and felt that faint static in my fingertips again. I said thank you without thinking. The closet gave one soft knock, just once. The following week, the weather turned vicious. Ice storms rolled through, and the power blinked out for a whole night. Jules and I sat in the living room with candles, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind shove against the walls. Around 11, she said. You hear that? I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. 3 taps, pause, 2, coming from upstairs. I tried to sound casual. Old pipes, I said. She tilted her head. Pipes don't knock in rhythm. The power came back before midnight, but I didn't go up to my room. I slept on the couch. Jules didn't say anything more, but the next morning she left early for class, and there was a sticky note on the fridge that read, Asterisk, whoever your ghost is, tell them rent's due. Asterisk. The joke helped, somehow. Humor gave the fear a smaller shape. I laughed while eating my cereal, even though the spoon trembled in my hand. In March, something shifted. I started waking up at exactly the same time each night, 2:21 in the morning. Not from a sound, not from cold, just awake, like someone had gently shaken my shoulder. I'd stare at the ceiling for a few minutes, then look toward the closet. Always closed. One night, I got up, crossed the room, and sat down on the floor facing it. I know you didn't mean to, I said quietly, but you're still here. What do you want? No answer, no tapping. Just a tiny draft brushing my cheek, faint as breath, then a slow creak as the door shifted half an inch open. My heart jumped, but I didn't move. Inside was darkness so thick it felt like it had weight. Something soft brushed the floorboards near my knee, and I realized the old coat, the one that had blocked the door the night I opened it months ago, had fallen forward. I reached out, touched the wool sleeve, cold, but not icy. My fingers brushed something inside the pocket. A small rectangle, paper maybe. I pulled it out. It was a photograph. Black and white, the edges curled. A woman in a long coat, standing in front of what looked like our porch. Snow at her feet. Eyes turned slightly away from the camera. She looked about my age, maybe younger. On the back, written in faded ink, Asterisk, January 1967. Asterisk. I sat there on the floor, holding it, listening to my pulse. The air in the room felt still, almost waiting. I whispered, Is this you? A tap. One, then another, then silence. I put the photo on the desk beside the journal. When I woke in the morning, the photo had moved turned face down, as if someone didn't want to be looked at anymore. That day, I called the city records office again. I asked about property reports from that year, pretending to be doing research. The woman on the phone sighed, but said she'd check. When she called back an hour later, her tone had changed. You're looking at Maple and 5th, right? She said. That house had a fire in '67. Small, but one person died. Gas leak, they think. A young tenant. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there with the phone heavy in my hand. I looked around the room, at the walls, at the window, at the old radiator clanking in the corner, and felt the line between then and now blur a little. That night, I wrote everything down. I told her because by then I thought of her as times her times, that I knew about the fire, that I was sorry. I wrote that it wasn't her fault. The pencil tip snapped halfway through the last word. Then, without touching it, the journal slid a few inches toward the edge of the desk and stopped. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter. The tapping stopped entirely for a while. Jules said maybe my ghost had graduated. I smiled, but the silence felt heavy, unfinished. Then, one night near the end of March, I woke again at 2:21. This time, the air was warmer than usual, almost humid. The smell of iron was back. The closet door was wide open. Inside, the darkness shimmered faintly, as if filled with moving air. I heard the smallest voice, like a sigh carried through a long tunnel. I couldn't make out words, but the tone, if that's what you can call it, felt like release. I stood, shaking, and said, It's okay, you can go. The darkness in the closet seemed to ripple once, then fade into stillness. The smell of iron thinned and was gone. I waited, breathing hard. Then, faintly, a final tapping from somewhere deep in the wall. 3, and 2, and nothing after. The next morning, sunlight filled the room like it hadn't in months. The air smelled clean, almost sharp. The journal sat open on the desk. One last line in that careful old handwriting. Asterisk. Thank you for listening. Asterisk. I didn't write back. I didn't have to. By April, the house felt new, or maybe just empty in the normal way again. I still caught myself knocking twice on the closet door, sometimes out of habit. Jules moved out that summer, and new tenants came in, bright-eyed freshmen who loved the vintage charm. I never told them a word. Years later, when I drive past Maple and Fifth, the house looks the same leaning porch. Too many coats of paint, but it doesn't feel heavy anymore. Sometimes I think I hear the faintest echo of tapping, just once, like a memory reminding me it was real. But I smile, because whatever she was, wherever she went, she wasn't angry anymore. I went years without thinking much about that house, at least not in the way that makes your stomach twist. Life moved on in all the regular, boring ways life tends to move on. I graduated, moved to a city where the buildings touched each other like crowded teeth, got a job at a small publishing office, and filled my days with deadlines, cheap coffee, and subway rides that smelled like metal and rain. The years stacked quietly. Every so often, a sound knuckles on a door, a heel against a floor would call something back from that winter, but it would fade before it could take shape. By the time I turned 30, the whole story had folded itself into a place in my memory that felt both near and far, like a postcard from someone you once knew but no longer answer. I told the story a few times at bars or small get-togethers, always half laughing, calling it my friendly haunting. People liked it. They'd lean in, eyes wide, ask if I ever found proof, if I ever went back. I always said no. I didn't want to ruin the calm that had come after. Then, in late 2014, an email arrived from Jules. We hadn't spoken in a few years, except for the occasional happy birthday message. The subject line said, "You're not going to believe this. The body was short, *, drove past the old house yesterday. It's for sale. I think you should see it. Something about it feels weirdly sad again. *. I stared at the message for a long time. The words didn't frighten me, not exactly, but they made a quiet hum under my ribs. That night, I dreamed of snow again, not inside the house this time, but falling over the porch, the wood soft and wet, footprints leading up the steps and stopping at the door. I woke with my heart racing and the old rhythm in my head. 3 and 2, patient, certain. The following weekend, I drove the 2 hours back to that college town. The road cut through bare fields and frozen ponds. I hadn't been there since graduation. It looked smaller, like someone had taken a deep breath and let the air out slowly. When I turned onto Maple and Fifth, the house stood exactly where memory left it, tilted, tired, still pretending not to listen. There was a small, "For sale by owner" sign in the yard, the kind printed at a hardware store. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, letting the engine tick itself cool. The snow along the sidewalk was crusted with ice, and my breath fogged the windshield. I almost drove away. Then I saw the curtain in the upstairs window shift, just slightly, like a draft or a curious hand. The front steps groaned under my boots. The paint was new, but already peeling. I rang the bell. A woman opened the door, a realtor, by the look of the clipboard. She smiled in that bright way people do when they need a sale. "Looking for a tour?" she asked. I told her I used to live here years ago, that I was curious. She didn't seem surprised. "We've had a few former tenants stop by," she said. "It's an old place. Everyone has some kind of story about it." Inside, it smelled of sawdust and lemon cleaner. The hardwood floors were sanded down, pale as bone. They'd knocked out a wall between the kitchen and living room. My old room was smaller than I remembered, the window lower, the corners less shadowed. The closet was still there, though the same brass knob, dulled with age. I stood in front of it, feeling the faint tremor of memory behind my ribs. The realtor said, "That door sticks something awful. We're thinking of replacing it." "Don't," I said before I could think. She blinked, then smiled politely and went to check her phone. I touched the knob. It was cold, but not in that deep, old way it used to be, just metal cold. The smell of iron wasn't there. The air felt normal. I almost convinced myself that all of it taps, notes. The photo had been my tired brain making patterns. Then I noticed something. The baseboard just beside the closet had a small gap, maybe from where new flooring didn't quite meet the old wall. A sliver of paper was wedged there, browned and stiff. I knelt, worked it free. It was a photo, another one, smaller than the first, curled at the edges. The same woman, same coat, same porch behind her, but this time she was smiling, just faintly. Her hand rested on the shoulder of someone cropped out of the frame. On the back, written in that same round handwriting, was a single line, asterisk, tell her I stayed, asterisk. I felt the floor move under me, or maybe it was just the rush of blood. The realtor's voice came from the hallway, distant and cheerful, talking about the new insulation. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket and stood. The closet door rattled once so soft it could have been a draft and then settled. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town. I couldn't sleep. I kept pulling the photo from my pocket, staring at it under the lamp. The words on the back seemed to shift in meaning every time I read them. Asterisk, tell her I stayed. Asterisk, stayed. Where? Stayed for who? I remembered the way the journal had said, asterisk, thank you for listening. Asterisk, had I misunderstood that goodbye? The next morning, I drove to the local historical society. The woman behind the desk, gray hair and a cardigan with little snowflakes, looked delighted to have someone to talk to. I told her I was researching old houses near Maple and Fifth. She brought out a folder of records, photocopies of old clippings and maps. There it was again, the fire, winter of 1967. The article was short. Asterisk, small blaze caused by faulty gas line. Tenant identified as 24-year-old Margaret Ellis. House to remain boarded pending repairs. Asterisk, the photo accompanying it was grainy, but the shape of the coat, the curve of the mouth, it was her. Margaret, I said the name quietly, and the woman at the desk looked up. You knew her? No, I said, not exactly. Back at the motel, I laid the two photos side by side on the bedspread. One from that winter, serious, alone. The other, smiling, with someone else beside her. I thought of the journal, the warnings, the voice that never rose above a whisper. I thought of that last message. Asterisk, thank you for listening. Asterisk, maybe she hadn't left after all. Maybe she'd just learned to rest. When I drove back home that evening, the sun fell low behind the trees, and the road looked like a long sheet of silver. I stopped once, just outside of town, to look back. The sky had that same pale color I remembered from the morning after the tapping ended. For the rest of that year, small things began to happen again, not frightening, just small echoes. A pen rolling to the edge of a desk, the sound of a single tap when I was alone in my apartment. Once, when I overslept, my alarm went off exactly 2 minutes after I should have left for work, as if someone had nudged it back on. I didn't talk about it. I didn't try to explain. Sometimes I think ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt connections. Maybe Margaret didn't stay in that house at all. Maybe she stayed in the space where someone once heard her, where someone said her name kindly. Maybe that's all a haunting really is. When the winter comes around each year and the pipes in my apartment start to knock from the cold, I find myself listening not with fear, but with that same quiet respect I learned all those years ago. 3 taps, a pause, 2. I whisper, I hear you. I used to think that chapter of my life had closed for good, but years have a way of circling back, like wind that remembers the shape of your house. By the time I hit my 40s, I'd moved 3 times, changed jobs twice, and built a life full of ordinary comforts. A small apartment above a bookstore, a cat who preferred the company of my laundry basket, and a few friends who never pressed when I went quiet during storms. Sometimes I'd still wake around 2:21 in the morning, no reason, just awake. It wasn't the same kind of fear, not the sharp pulse of those first months. It was more like a tap on the shoulder from memory. I'd lie there in the dark, the cat curled against my knees, and listen to the hum of the city. Every so often, I'd swear I heard it faint, steady, the rhythm that once lived behind my wall. 3 and 2, always patient, always polite. The first real return came one November night in 2022. I was unpacking boxes after moving into a new place, an old brownstone near the river, creaky but honest. The previous tenant had left a small stack of books in the hall closet. One of them was a battered poetry collection, thin and yellowed. When I opened it, a piece of folded paper slid out. The handwriting hit me before the words did the same rounded, careful strokes I hadn't seen in more than a decade. It said only, asterisk. There are doors that do not close. There are hands that learn to rest. Asterisk. I sat on the floor holding that scrap, feeling every sound in the room flatten to silence. I didn't know how it got there, and after so many years, I didn't bother with explanations. Maybe it had followed me, or maybe some accidents aren't accidents at all. I put the paper in a frame and hung it by the window. That winter was quiet in the way good winters are long nights. Soup on the stove, the cat watching snow fall like it was a movie just for him. Life went on, simple and steady, but I carried that line in my head like a melody, asterisk hands that learn to rest, asterisk. In January, I got an email from a new owner of the old house on Maple and Fifth. They'd found my name in an old rental record and tracked me down through the alumni network. The message was polite. Asterisk, we're renovating the upstairs and came across a notebook with your initials on the inside cover. Would you like it back? Asterisk, I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, or maybe affection, got the better of me. A week later, a padded envelope arrived. Inside was my journal, the one from that winter in 2006. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed at the edges, but my handwriting was unmistakable. There was something else, though, a new page I didn't write. It was near the middle, between two old entries. The ink was faded but legible. Asterisk, you kept the door open long enough. I sat there at my kitchen table, morning light sliding across the page, and I felt the quiet kind of peace that comes after a long misunderstanding. For years, I'd thought she wanted release, escape, forgiveness. Maybe all she wanted was witness someone to stand there and say, asterisk, I see you, I hear you, asterisk. I closed the journal and made tea, letting the kettle hiss and sigh. That's when I noticed the sound, not in the walls, not in the floor, but from the window pane itself. 3 soft taps, a pause, 2 more. I smiled before I even turned my head. The glass trembled once, just lightly, as if touched by fingers that weren't cold anymore. Then, nothing but the soft patter of sleet against the street. Years have worn the edge off that story. I don't tell it much now. When I do, people tilt their heads and smile. The kind of smile that means they don't quite believe but don't want to call you a liar. That's fine. It's not a story that asks for belief. It just asks for listening. I've learned since then that most hauntings aren't about fear, they're about unfinished attention. A presence waiting for acknowledgement, a name waiting to be spoken, a door waiting to be opened just once. Some people leave behind a voice, some leave behind silence that still wants to be heard. Every year, on the last cold night of January, I light a single candle and set it by the window, not out of ritual or superstition, but gratitude. I sit in the quiet, the way I once sat in that old room, and I wait. Sometimes I hear nothing at all. Sometimes there's the smallest sound, the tap-tap, pause, tap-tap, and the air feels full, like a breath held and released. And I say, softly, it's all right, I'm still here. Because after all these years, that's what I've come to believe. Ghosts aren't just the ones who linger. Sometimes we're the ones who stay, carrying their echoes forward so they don't have to. And maybe that's all the haunting ever wanted to be, a reminder that even the quietest knocks deserve an answer.